and I was feeling a little bit lost. I wanted to get back to that writing, I guess just find a purpose for my life. And I was like, I should start a blog. And then I thought about it for a second and I was like, I could start a blog.
Welcome to the Nerds of Prey. We are bridging the gap between faith and fandom by introducing you to the leading folks on the front lines of nerd ministry. These are the people I have met as I plant a church for nerds, geeks, and gamers. I found them, so you don't have to. Folks, I am Nerd Pastor Nate, and this is a Checkpoint Church podcast that has been dropping every 3 weeks. Each episode of this podcast is going to feature someone at the intersection of faith and fandom. We'll then sit down with them and learn their story. How did they first discover that God is in pop culture, and where do they see things going from here? Well, our guest for today is a real treat, and we're going to be interviewing Shaneen Thompson from Hoot Howl. Shaneen considers herself a writer and a geek and a Christian. She hails from Alberta, Canada, and she runs the Hoot Howl. Now, the Hoot Howl is a place for geeks of any level and class, according to their website, from level 1 rogues to level 20 clerics. All geeks are welcome there. They are creating blogs, they're hosting other bloggers, and they're even creating resources and Bible studies for nerds to make use of. Most recently, Shaneen has been a featured contributor to Thy Geekdom Come, which is a nerdy devotional series, and she's also become an active member of the One Geek 411 podcast and Twitch stream. Shaneen also was one of the starting voices for Geeky Christian Twitter, which Twitter is a beast that I will never understand, and so I totally respect her for being willing to brave that strange place. In this podcast, we're going to get into more about Twitter. We're talking about how to write in a collaborative effort like Thy Geekdom Come, like those kind of devotional series, and so much more. With that, folks, let's get into the show. Here is our latest Nerd of Prey, Shaneen Thompson from Hoot Howl. Let's start out with just the easy one, the easiest question, which is, who are you? And then where are you currently, both physically and then also on social media? So what are your favorite platforms, and then where are you in the world?
Yeah, so I'm Shaneen. I'm from Alberta, Canada. Not much else interesting about me, I feel, but you can find me at thehootenhowl.com, where I talk about Jesus and all geeky things. Everything from video games to anime to Marvel to Doctor Who, just all of the things. I love hanging out at Twitter. You can find me at the Hoot and Howl there, and I'm also on Facebook and Instagram as Hoot and Howl Tales.
Very cool. So you've got the gamut, you've got it all spread out with the Hoot and Howl and the website and stuff like that. So that's super exciting, and we'll talk more about that. I want to know, so just judging by some of the things that you've written and some of the persona that you've put out there, I can tell you have a lot of passion for anime, which is super cool. I'm right there with you. You are one of the few people I know. I read your Thy Geekdom Come, where you talk about Violet Evergarden. That is like one of my favorite anime, and I feel like nobody has ever heard of it. Either they've like seen it, they've seen it on Netflix, and they're like, oh, that looked boring. And I'm like, no, like you need to watch it. It's so good. So I felt very affirmed to find another Christian anime fan, because that isn't something that always happens. So far, we've found that most people are a melting pot. If you had to sum up your nerddom, your fandom, your geekiness into one thing, what flavor of nerd would you describe yourself as, if you could only pick one?
It's pretty broad, but I'm just going to have to say fantasy.
Okay. No, that totally works. So does that typically warrant towards like medieval fantasy, would you say? Or is it something in between?
It can. I definitely enjoy that, but I think any type of fantasy really is great. Science fantasy, urban fantasy, any kind of fantasy.
I feel like a lot of what I know about you is where you're at right now. And so I'm super curious to know, where did your nerd journey begin? Have you been a lifelong nerd? Did you grow up on this stuff, or what did it look like? Was this a new awakening?
I think I would consider myself a fairly new nerd, I guess, compared to some people. I definitely grew up devouring books. So I've been a book nerd my whole life. And I'd say youth group is really where my nerddom started. I had one particularly nerdy youth group leader, and he's the one that got me into like Carcassonne and role-playing games, and he is actually still my current GM, and that group of friends also got me into like the MCU. All kind of snowballed from there.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So my own personal origin story is that my youth group didn't do any of that. My leader was very cool in their own way, but didn't really get into the nerdy sphere. And so like I would be wanting to play Smash, and everybody would be like, what about we play another round of horse, with the basketball goal? Why don't we try that again? And I was like, I want to play Smash. And so Yeah, that's super interesting to me that was your introduction, whereas that was an area that didn't work so much for me. So that's super cool. I find that mentors, a leader or somebody to guide us into this thing is a viable possibility to get started on this nerd journey. Where did you first kind of discover this? Well, it sounds like you may have discovered it from day one. So the intersection between faith and fandom is something that is sometimes hard to find, something that a lot of people don't find right at the get-go. But if you were introduced to it from youth group, maybe you knew about it from the origin story. So where did you first really discover this intersection between faith and fandom, either whether was it in your youth group, or did you find it online whenever you started to build this geeky Christian Twitter world and all that?
Yeah, I don't think it was necessarily conscious right from the beginning, but that leader who got me into all the geeky things also loved talking about Jesus and grace. So I always associated those two things as being related because I saw them both in him. I don't know, I've always loved stories, and there's always truth to be found in stories. I guess as I grew and just had experience with more stories and things like that, it just kind of came naturally to see the truth in them.
Yeah, that's a recurring theme that keeps coming up in these conversations is this power of the story, and that we can find these themes that are, historic and in the Bible and through the life of Jesus, but we're also still finding them in media today. So an obvious question, hopefully, but I am prepared for someone to say no to it eventually. One of these days, I'm convinced somebody is going to be like, no. So do you believe that God can use fandoms for good? And if so, how have you seen or how have you created these opportunities yourself?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely the opportunity for fandoms to be not such a great place. I'm more of the school of thought that people can enjoy what they enjoy, and we can all have like a fun community together, just talking about the things that we enjoy. And it's not necessary to hate on anybody else for not enjoying our things. Yeah, beyond that, getting to talk about the truths and stuff that we do find in fandoms has been really awesome. Yeah, on the blog, just in general, in the community on Twitter and stuff, talking about, I guess, not just the stories that we enjoy, but the stories that have really impacted us.
I find that really interesting, talking about disagreement and talking about, the toxicity that can come up in the midst of fandom. I think there's two interesting worlds amongst us in our nerd communities. We have grognards. We have these people who are really like gatekeepers, who are really good at stopping interest and being like, you're not a real fan if you don't know this and this and this. That's one of the big reasons why I'm super careful what I talk about. I know you're a really big Doctor Who fan. I have seen the Eccleston season, and I've seen a couple episodes of Tenet, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm Doctor Who aficionado. I'm not going to pretend that I know everything about it. And if I tried, I know that the Doctor Who fandom would eat me alive. And so there's a weirdness, right? A tension of toxicity going on there. So have you found any conflict with that kind of mentality? Have you found a lot of pushback on this kind of let's all get along, or have you not really run into those gatekeepers?
I try to avoid it as much as I can, so I haven't had too much issue with it. I don't know. I don't consider myself like super huge into any particular fandom either. Like if I was to get in with like the real nerds, I wouldn't pass. So that's part of the reason I'm passionate about not gatekeeping, because you don't have to know everything about a fandom to enjoy it.
I think that's a great place to be. I think that's a great place to start, and hopefully there are more of you out there. I think that you're exactly what the world needs as far as the geekdom and the gatekeeping goes, and maybe that's why you're finding such a good home on Twitter, because I find that to be an incredibly divisive place. Twitter is somewhere where there's a lot of that anonymity. There's a lot of the argument. I mean, it's not quite as bad as the YouTube comment section, but it's getting there. Maybe your peacekeeping mentality is what really makes you feel comfortable being so proficient in Twitter. Can you tell us more about why? Why Twitter? Why does that seem to be the area? I mean, that's definitely how I found out about you and Geeky Christian Twitter that you started over there. Why Twitter?
That's a good question. It wasn't the first social media that I went to. I don't know, I kind of found it intimidating almost, I guess, and kind of like, there's the Twitter people, and I don't know how Twitter works. That's weird. I decided to get on there just to see if we could reach more people there. Now Twitter's my favorite social media. And I'm like, whoa, how did that happen?
What do you think was that evolution? What made you say, this is my favorite now? What changed?
I think part of it is I, like going back to my love of stories, I also really love words. And Twitter is just words for the most part. Like, I don't have to worry about making a pretty picture for Instagram or anything like that. Like, we can just talk.
There we go. That's it. So that's interesting. So it's just, I mean, hey, it doesn't have to be a fancy thing. I mean, these social media apps all like serve this one purpose and this one form of media. And I think Twitter knows that that's what it does. It is the app for words. It's the mini blog, the micro blog, that kind of thing. If you had to put a vision forward for this Geeky Christian Twitter thing, what do you see the future looking like there? Are you happy with where it's at, or do you have big goals in plan for the future of this thing?
I kind of stole the idea of Geeky Christian Twitter from Weird Christian Twitter. I discovered that community first, just a whole bunch of Christians who think they're a little bit weird, just having great community together. And I was like, hey, geeky Christians need this too, because I was having a hard time finding geeky Christians in the beginning. And then once you get into it, you're like, wait, there's tons of us. I thought it would be really awesome if we could have a place on Twitter where we could all find each other. So like some things that I've seen Weird Christian Twitter do are having like prayer meetings over Zoom and like movie nights, and they've started a podcast and stuff like that. So there's a whole bunch of things kind of in the back of my mind, like, maybe that would be fun.
You said you kind of borrowed from Weird Christian Twitter and you had some ideas that were overlapping there. What was it about Weird Christian Twitter that drew you in? Was it just that community? Was it just that network? Was there like one moment that you were like, that's why we need this? Like, did you see an interaction or something that was like, oh yeah, no, the geeks definitely need this? Like, what was that moment that it clicked?
I don't think there was necessarily one moment. I had stumbled on to this place where everyone seemed to know each other. It's so hard to find that community, sometimes in person and online as well. So if we could just have a place like that where everyone can just know each other.
Let's backtrack a little bit and talk some more about Hoot and Howl. What is Hoot and Howl? Just give us the elevator pitch, and then we'll break it down a little bit further into what this was.
It's a blog where I talk about Jesus and geeky things and how they connect.
That's the shortest elevator ride ever. I love it. Yeah. So what was the origin? Where did this first get started? Did you have the name and you were like, I'm going to do a blog and this is just where it is? Or was it I'm writing posts on Facebook every single week. Maybe I should try a blog. Like how did this thing very first get started?
I had always loved writing. I grew up writing stories and just whatever else I felt like writing. I'd kind of reached a point in my life where, just because of the season, I wasn't writing as much. It was something that I missed. And I was also at a season where a lot of things were ending and beginning, and I was feeling a little bit lost. I wanted to get back to that writing, I guess just find a purpose for my life. And I was like, I should start a blog. And then I thought about it for a second, and I was like, I could start a blog. And then I did. Shout out to my wonderful husband for the name.
You got the idea. You decided it was time. You were looking for a purpose. You wanted to move forward, and you did. I think that is an accomplishment that a lot of people don't realize, that there is this brick wall dividing us between doing the thing and not doing the thing. And you did the thing, right? And so that's an exciting step. So what was there a light bulb moment beyond just, I could do this? Or was there something that like resolved within you to push forward? You had the opportunity to say, oh, everybody has a blog. Nobody's going to read my blog. Like what maybe pushed you over the edge to say yes to this thing rather than just to put it off?
I don't know. I really think that moment was it. I had been meeting with a friend to talk about the Chronicles of Narnia. I love C.S. Lewis. I love Narnia. And talking about Narnia and Jesus. And I was like, I could write this. And there you go. I guess it's all Lewis's fault.
There we go. I feel like Lewis and Tolkien can be traced back to many of our nerds' love of fantasy. So what's the future then look like here for Hoot and Howl? Are you just gonna plan on doing more and more blogs? Are you thinking about a book in the future? Are you thinking about what does this look like? Collaboration?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that I'm thinking about. Having more writers for the blog eventually would be really awesome. Currently, I think we'll just stick with me. Speaking of collaborations, I also appear on the First Geek 411 podcast. Kind of same thing, we talk about Jesus and geeky things. And we've also started streaming video games on Twitch, which is 100% something I never thought I'd be doing. That's been fun to grow the community that way, just hanging out and playing video games. Yeah, I would love to write a book eventually.
Yeah, I feel like that's all of us, right? So I'm also an aspiring writer, right? We love to refer to ourselves as an aspiring, even though we're writers. We've done the things. I mean, I know you said you've always loved stories. Have you also always loved writing stories, telling stories, or did it just start out as reading and just eventually blossom into that thing? Where did this origin of a love of writing and storytelling begin?
I mean, I think it started in the womb. We have home video of me before I could even talk, flipping through a book and going, pretending to read this book. And I have a book that I wrote apparently before I could write because it's my mom's handwriting in the book. She wrote it all down, what I dictated to her. Yeah, right from the get-go. And I have very many half-completed novels from high school and all that kind of fun stuff.
Yeah, we have a thing we're doing right now on my Twitch stream where we'll go back and read my book that I wrote whenever I was 10 years old. I was in 5th grade and I started writing a book with all my friends and all my friends in it. And yeah, it's pretty embarrassing. It's pretty cringy to go back and to read that old stuff, but it is fun. So one thing I've always run into, and maybe you feel differently, so I'd love to explore this more. I have only recently even dipped my toe into the water. It was really only because of seminary. Dipped my toe into the water of nonfiction. I hate nonfiction. I loathe it. I've never had any interest in it, and I certainly have never had any interest in creating it. But a lot of what you are creating is storytelling that is nonfiction. It's a craft between the two. It's not like it's boring, and that's what it kind of took me to discover, is that you can be a storyteller and write nonfiction. And I think it was actually Malcolm Gladwell that kind of taught me that. But have you ever run into that issue, or do you find nonfiction to just be super edifying? What do you think about the world of fantasy and then the world of nonfiction, fiction and nonfiction?
I used to hate nonfiction, like the same thing. It was just so boring. Why would I want to read nonfiction when there's all of these great fiction novels to be reading? Yeah, I never found anything that grabbed me and made me want to read it until probably this past year. I've suddenly started reading a ton of nonfiction. I have a bunch of great nonfiction recommendations now because I've found books that I suddenly can't put down. Yeah, I think the best ones that I've found are ones that are written in a way that feels like having a coffee date with a friend. They're kind of talking just about like a casual subject that most people can relate to, and then kind of somehow weaving that into deeper themes, talking about like life and faith and art.
I feel like that can be an even harder thing to find. I like I said, seminary. So I've read a lot of Christian nonfiction. I've read a lot of Christian education, and some of them are real good. Most of them, not so much. Like it's pretty rough to find. But I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so encouraged by the likes of Hoot and Howl and Love Thy Nerd. All these different organizations that are putting together really, really interesting, readable, and well-crafted Christian nonfiction storytelling and reviews. I find that to be a really encouraging thing for me. And I see that especially through things like Thy Geekdom Come. So let's talk more about that. How did you get plugged in there? Was that just through Geeky Christian Twitter, or did you just connect with the right people?
Yeah, I think I just stumbled across Mythos and Ink probably on Twitter by accident at some point. I had picked up their first devotional, That Geekdom Come Volume 1, and I saw them put out the call for submissions for volume 2. And I was like, why not? What's the worst that could happen? They say no. And so I submitted a devotional about Doctor Who, surprise, surprise, and they accepted it. And then asked for another one. Kind of a wild experience for me. Being published is one of my dreams, and then it happened.
That's awesome. So it's just, one step down the road and you're going to keep on going forward. So, I mean, is that something that you see in your future? I mean, would you like to pursue more of this kind of thing, more of a collaborative effort of devotional writing? Or do you see publishing a fiction novel of a fantasy story of your own, or maybe publishing a nonfiction kind of breakdown of some of the discoveries you've made along the way? Like, what would you like to write if you could pick anything? What would you write? What would be your debut? All right, is Shaneen Thompson's debut work? What is it? What is this first book that you're publishing?
Oh boy. I don't know. I think the older I get, the more I'm very aware of my audience, not necessarily always in a good way. That makes fiction writing very difficult for me. So I feel like a debut in a devotional form or something like that would be easier. Just gotta work that imagination muscle a little bit more, and then we'll come out with that fantasy.
Yeah, I think it's an intimidating thing, right? I mean, once you put that out there, that's a real baby. That's something that you've nurtured from, its very conception. And so that's something terrifying to put something like that out into the world, whereas nonfiction, there's really only so much debate that can go into it. Somebody can disagree with what you're saying, but when it's fantasy, they can disagree with what you've created. And that's a tricky place to be. I think it's a strange land that we live in, especially as writers and as content creators. Do you see a disconnect there between, your world on your blog, your world on Twitter, and then the bigger market of maybe an independent publishing or something like that? I mean, they're two different worlds, digital media and then print media. Is there any kind of overlap that you found, or do you really see them as being two different worlds between these people that read print books and people that read Twitter feeds? What does that look like?
I mean, I think there's quite a bit of overlap for me, because a lot of my community on Twitter are also book nerds. We read books. Yeah, it does feel like a completely different world. Like, I can put it on my blog. I don't have to pass that by anyone. It's just there now because I said so.
Yeah, that's nice. The approval process is definitely a big thing. I mean, being able to publish stuff yourself it means that it'll be seen probably by less people unless you really market it, but it also means that you don't have to run it through anyone.
Yep.
That's super nice. It's actually something that's been on my mind recently, and this is tangential, and then we can get back on topic. Sorry to tangent away, but I've been thinking about Bo Burnham's special. I don't know if you've seen it, Inside. He's kind of playing it up this entire time. He's creating this thing all himself. He's creating this comedy stand-up special from his home during quarantine. It hit me during one of his songs that I was like, I mean, yes, he is, but he's also on Netflix. So he went through a producer. Like, he had to send this passion project to a producer who was like, Bo, maybe change that one song that you filmed in your bedroom, right? Like, that's such a weird thing, and something that we take for granted as content creators is like, yes, our stuff isn't on Netflix, but we also don't have to run through a producer. We also don't have to get that thumbs up or that stamp of approval. And somebody that's trying to be as independent and as fresh and as cynical as Bo Burnham, even he is having to go through a thumbs up process by a producer. And that's just something really interesting and humbling to me. Changing gears, because I know I just went on a tangent there. One of the things that's on your website, Hoot Howl, that is a little bit different, maybe from what you're doing with your blog, is you also offer resources and Bible study programs. So talk more about that. How did that get started, and what do you see that doing?
I have a few free resources to download. Some of them are kind of like a Bible verse a day for a month on a certain theme. Another one is a fun, your own personal Bible time resource for being more creative and writing stories and seeing if that can be a part of your Bible time. connecting with God in a different way. I think they're just things that helped me, I guess, topics that everyone kind of deals with. It can be a struggle to find the right passage, I guess, in the Bible that can bring truth to a situation as well as comfort. So yeah, just having a list of Bible verses, I think, can be really helpful when you're feeling at a loss.
Yeah, I find it really interesting, your integration of these two things and of these different methods of reaching people with your faith. What is your role as this creator? Do you see yourself as kind of a facilitator of conversation? You know, me personally, I see myself as kind of a pastor of a community. So what I'm trying to do through my church is I'm trying to build community. How do you see your writing and your creation? I mean, do you see this as a means to an end to create this community, or is that more on Twitter?
My Geek and Faith mentor loves to talk about God's grace. That's kind of his just favorite thing to talk about. If we could talk about anything for the rest of forever, it would be God's grace. I always leave conversations with him feeling incredibly loved, incredibly blessed, just knowing more of God and Jesus. And that's really been my goal as well with the Hoot Howl, is I want people to leave knowing God and knowing his grace for them.
It sounds like your mentor might like John Wesley. That's just my own. I'm a Methodist through and through, so I've got to give it up to John. I agree. I think that I see our creation and I see our method of connecting these two things as an act of grace, as an act of offering grace to others. I think one of the ways that we do that is, like you mentioned, through the story. So let's talk more about story. What do you see as being so important about story? Why is story such a big factor in your life?
Story is kind of the big way that we learn. I work at a daycare, and something that they're doing right now is called learning stories. So we make stories about what the kids are learning, what we're seeing them doing and exploring in their lives. And then they can look and see like, oh, I was trying to balance on this beam and I kept trying and then I did it. And so even they can see the stories of their own life, and that's how they're learning right now. I think that kind of applies to all of us as we're growing. We learn through stories, whether that's the story of our own life or the stories of events and things around us, the story of the Bible, as well as fictional stories.
Yeah, we're able to kind of read ourselves into the story. Let's talk a little bit about the future and where you think this intersection might be headed. So the way I've been putting this for some of our other interviewees here is I've been asking about not so much where do you actually think it's logically going, but if you could dream a dream, if you could dream anything 10, 15, 20 years down the road, there's no doubt that nerd culture is becoming more and more ubiquitous. It's becoming a thing that people know about. It's becoming a thing that people care about. My hope is that with that, we're also going to see more of a rise of things like Checkpoint, of things like Hoot and How, of things like Love Thy Nerd. And so I'm hoping for more nerdy Christian communities. So what do you see as being your dream? If you could dream a dream for the future of this geeky Christian intersection, what would you see the future looking like?
Yeah, I think I'd love to see more in-person communities, like seeing those giant booths at cons and tabletop gatherings and all kinds of in-person communities where people can really get plugged in.
So more in-person plugins or ways for people to get connected and involved. I'm curious to know more about that. What do you see as the role of in-person? I think that's something that we're having to ask ourselves a lot as we're kind of transitioning out of this period of COVID and trying to figure out what the future looks like for these digital communities. How would you understand that, the role of in-person gathering? Do you think it needs to be something that's done every week or once a month, or like Comic-Con where it's like once a year where we gather together?
I mean, I guess it depends on the scale of the event, but I don't know, over this past year and a bit, in-person has been definitely something I have missed a lot. And it is required for a lot of geek hobbies, especially like the tabletop community. really hard to transfer that one to online. Yeah, I don't know. Small weekly tabletop groups, bi-weekly D&D groups, monthly gatherings, I don't know, anything.
More events, more things. We just want all the things. We want more stuff going on. I totally resonate with that. I think I'm excited for where things go in the future and what the future looks like for this intersection. I'm excited to see more and more of these kind of gatherings. I see more conventions like this happening. I mean, so far I've only heard of a couple. There's SquadCon in Virginia, and there's LTN Con. There's some of those things going on here and there, but I would love to see even bigger and even more collaborative. I don't see any reason why we all have to have our own little separate con. I want to do one major con, you know. And then I'm not even sure. I mean, I'm going to be honest. I don't even know necessarily, and this would be a great conversation. What does the geeky Christian world look like in Canada? I mean, I it just like clicked that I was like, I'm mentioning all these United States, you know, churches. Like, what does the geek Christian world look like in Canada? How does that approach? Is there anything that you found, or is it just pretty much things that are connecting you through the internet in the States?
Yeah, it's mostly been in the States through the internet. Mythos and Ink that published the devotional I was in are actually Canadian. They're from Manitoba, so that was kind of fun to discover. Yeah, other than that, I haven't found a lot of Canadians.
Whenever we eventually do plan this con, we'll make you our representative from Canada. We'll be sure that we'll have it. We'll have a con up in Canada, and you'll be the one facilitating that for sure.
Absolutely.
So one question that I like to ask as we kind of come to a close with this is I like for people to give, you know, you mentioned you got a lot of recommendations. So this is kind of a time to flout some of those recommendations if you'd like. We like to ask, what are you watching? What are you playing, and what are you reading? And just for clarification, playing counts as video games or tabletop, whatever. You can be playing Monopoly for all that I care. And then what are you reading? Audiobooks certainly count. We've had that come up a lot. That question is like, do audiobooks count? And it's like, yes, absolutely. Audiobooks are reading, dang it. So yeah, that's one of those things that people seem to run into. So what are you watching? What are you playing? And what are you reading?
I guess we just caught up on Attack on Titan. So now I'm just waiting for the last half of the final season.
Yeah,
real upset. Real upset that my husband made me watch the whole series before it was all out. I'm actually a new anime fan. I was not that into it before and hadn't seen any, and then took me a while to get into it, and now I think Attack on Titan has firmly placed me in the anime fandom.
Rock on.
So, what am I playing? I'm playing Immortals Phoenix Rising. Love Greek mythology and doing it in fun, goofy ways. So, that's been fun. I'm also a new video gamer, so I'm playing on easy.
There's absolutely no shame in it. No shame in it. Yeah, only some games choose to shame you with that whenever you play like baby mode or something, and they'll put like a little bib on you. There's a couple games like that. It sounds like a thing like Doom. I'm pretty sure Doom does that. And you know what? No shade here. I would not put a bonnet on anybody that plays in easy, because I play mini games in easy as well. All right, and then the final one is what are you reading?
I'm reading so many things. I think I'm in the middle of like 8 books, according to my Goodreads right now. I'm currently reading the Sword of Truth series by Terry Goodkind. It's like just your typical fantasy series. Lots of magic, lots of war, and big world-ending problems.
So you're neck deep in that one. You've read it. You've read a good chunk of it. Yeah, I'm the same way. I read 7 books. I read 1 chapter out of 7 books every single morning. That's my practice. That's my habit. I love it. It's good. It's consistent. It gets me through a bunch of books a year. I'm very similar in that way. I'm currently watching the final season of Castlevania, which is quite gory, but if you liked Attack on Titan, I think you'd probably dig it. It's got that same level of gore and drama. I am currently playing Hotline Miami 2. I'm really going for the gore this time. I didn't even realize. So yeah, Castlevania, and then I'm playing Hotline Miami 2, and that's because of my stream. They voted for me to play Hotline Miami 1, and I got hooked. And so now I'm already into the sequel. It's so good. And then I am currently reading, I actually just finished a new manga called Days on Fez. It was all right. It's a manga on music festivals. And it's kind of a slice of life of these 2 couples, 2 guys, 2 girls that go to music festivals. And that's the story. So it's nothing too interesting, nothing too deep, but it's beautiful art. It looks really good. More interestingly, I'm still reading School Frozen in Time. That one I would recommend more. That's super interesting, where I've been talking about this. People that are going to be listening to these podcast episodes are going to be like, man, is he reading this book forever? But it's all of this story about these, I think it's like 7 students who are trapped in a school. Time has stopped, hence the Frozen in Time. A year prior, someone in their class had committed suicide or had death by suicide. They are trying to figure out who it was, and that one of them is actually the one who did it, and they can't remember. So they've had their memory wiped. They can't remember who did it. And so the big whodunit is they're trying to remember who was it that died by suicide the year prior. Are they going to be able to survive long enough to figure out who did it? And so it's kind of this interesting play on the theme of a murder mystery, like Agatha Christie, but instead it's along the lines of we're not trying to find out who the killer is. We're trying to remember who died, and it's playing with these themes of memory and talking about those who have gone before and talking about those with mental illness. And did we actually care? Do we even care a year after they're gone? Really, really dark themes, but really, really interesting exploration of characters. And then the art, interestingly enough, is done by the artist of Your Lie in April, which if you've never watched Your Lie in April, please go watch Your Lie in April, especially if you liked Violet Evergarden. Oh my gosh, the feels, the tears, you're going to absolutely be bawling the entire time, and it's so good. If you like music too, Your Lie in April is even better because it's got beautiful music. So it's by the artist of Your Lie in April, which could not be a different story from School Frozen in Time. So very much an interesting read. I'll have to check out. My thing about fantasy books is I have no idea how I would ever get into them because they're so long. I've been wanting to read the Witcher series forever, and I can't. It's too intimidating. Even looking at it, even looking at the first book, I'm like, this will never happen. I'll never read this. So I don't know how you do it. It blows my mind.
That was my husband's favorite series growing up, so he convinced me to read it.
Somehow it feels not intimidating to read all 26 volumes of Full Metal Alchemist, but whenever I want to read the 8 volumes of Witcher, I'm like, no, not going to happen. For our final question, just a quick time to shout out. I know you already mentioned First Geek 411. You've mentioned Hoot Howl, but go ahead and bring them up again. What are the different projects you're working on right now? Where can people find you? And be sure to drop your handle for your Twitch stream.
Yeah, you can find me at thehootandhowl.com, and Twitter, I'm the Hoot and Howl, and Instagram, I'm Hoot and Howl Tales, Tales. And then you can also find me on the First Geek 411 podcast. And you can find everything you need to know at onegeek411.com. And Twitch is also twitch.com/onegeek411.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Shaneen. We really do appreciate it. And hopefully people will check it out. You've got quite a lot to read through on Hoot and Howl, so I know that people can enjoy delving into that backlog if they haven't. And then First Geek 411, I'm sure they have quite a rich backlog. I'll follow them for sure. Great stuff. Thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, and that is a wrap on this episode of Nerds of Prey. I really hope that you enjoyed this podcast. This show is distributed free of charge and worldwide, but we would still love your support and help by giving us a 5-star review, sharing the episode around to your friends so that we can reach as many nerds, geeks, and gamers as humanly possible. Be sure to go and follow our special guest, Shaneen, on all of the links in the show notes below. Give her some kind words of encouragement for all the stuff that Hoot and Howl is doing. If you enjoyed this discussion and maybe you want to talk more about this, hey, feel free to join us over in the Checkpoint Church Discord. We'll be talking about all sorts of exciting things that Shaneen brought to the table, not to mention that this episode actually did premiere on our Twitch channel, so be sure to follow twitch.tv/checkpointchurch if you aren't already to catch the next episode and discuss it live with the viewers. Our next episode will be dropping 3 weeks from today and will feature the bard of Bard and Bible himself, Mike Perna. Look forward to that, and thanks again for giving us a listen. If you have any recommendations or have anyone that you would like to have considered as a future guest on the podcast, maybe it's you, then be sure to submit your name and biography to checkpointchurch@gmail.com, and we would love to have you on the show. Nerds of Prey is recorded, edited, produced, and distributed by Nathan Webb and Checkpoint Church. The Checkpoint Church podcast is the hub for all of our podcast sermons and special projects. To learn more, go to checkpointchurch.com or send questions to checkpointchurch@gmail.com. Remember, we believe 3 things to be true about every single one of you listening, regardless of where you might be with God. We firmly believe that God loves you, we love you, and you matter. That's all for this one. I have been your Nerd Pastor Nate. This has been the Nerds of Prey. Special thanks to our guest, Shaneen Thompson. Until next time, bye-bye!